Hello everyone, I've got a new special series here on the channel and it is going to be reviewing scenarios. But I'm not doing it by myself because it's kind of uninteresting for one person to talk about what they think. It's much better to have someone to talk to. So I'm going to introduce you to Superfeng99, who is also another content creator here on YouTube for Arkham Horror the card game. And he's going to help me with discussing all the scenarios in the game. So Superfang99, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your channel and you, the Arkham Horror, the card game player.
Hello, yes, this is Superfeng99. Thank you so much for having me on for this series. I'm super excited. Like you said, yeah, I'm also an Arkham LCG content creator. I focus on IRL play, if that makes sense, in paper stuff. I have a setup with a whole table and stuff. Um, but yeah, honestly, I love this game. I think now I'm going on, I think 3 years is when I started this game, about 3 years ago, and I've sort of fell in love with it. Started playing for the channel a year and a half ago now, and yeah, super excited to share my opinions with you and of course your audience for all of the scenarios.
All right, great. So we've talked about this quite a bit, and we've had a way to sort of talk about scenarios in a consistent manner, and we're going to be looking at scenarios through a couple different lenses. One, of course, is the blind playthrough, the first playthrough. We find that to be pretty important because it really tells you whether or not you want to keep playing this game or the campaign or revisit it later. But also, it can be potentially very different from subsequent playthroughs. So we want to talk about that as well. And the player count of a scenario can drastically change the nature of a scenario too. So I have experience playing 2-player, 3-player mostly, and a little bit of 4-player. But Superfang, you play all player counts.
Correct. Yes, my main play group is 4 player, and I've played a lot of 3 player, and of course, I play 2 player for the channel. So I hope to have some perspective on those player counts. I've also played not a lot, but a fair bit of true solo. So I don't know if there'll be so much input for true solo, but there are some scenarios that do indeed change very much in true solo.
And I barely have touched True Solo, so it'd be really good to have a different perspective on that player count. All right, so we want to also discuss the encounter decks of the scenario as not just its own thing, which I think is super cool to see how they've designed the encounter deck itself, but also how it contributes to the ratings for the entire scenario. We kind of think about the scenario often as the map, the locations, the act and agenda, but a lot of what happens because of the encounter deck, right? The players have their turn, and then the game has its turn, and often it's the construction of the encounter deck and what ends up in your threat area or what enemies pop up where that makes a scenario. So we'll be talking about that a little bit as we go on as well. We'll be talking about our ratings, and then we're actually going to try to dive into the scenario mechanics itself more specifically in our scenario reviews. We're also going to use that time to look at particularly important moments during a given scenario and maybe offer some helpful tips and strategies, especially highlighting some player cards that might be interesting and helpful that you haven't really thought about in the particular scenario. And we'll mention a little bit about the return to variants. These are only going to be for the first, how many campaigns? 5? I think it's through the Circle Undone.
Correct.
And we'll talk about some changes. Some of them have bigger changes than others, but it's worth mentioning that the designers did go back and perhaps change some things in the Return to that might make, in fact, the original scenario a little bit better or tighter. Okay, so that said, we have 4 categories that we think will help us discuss the scenarios in Arkham Horror the card game, and we will list them here and then discuss them a little bit more in depth on the next few slides. So one category is replayability. Next is what we call fairness, balance, and then finally the overall experience. So we took some time to discuss these, and there's going to be a lot of overlap between a few of them conceptually, but we tried to come up with some criteria and questions to ask ourselves after we played a scenario about each of these that might try to separate things a little bit. So let's go ahead and look at replayability first. And kind of the general gist is, how different is each playthrough? Granted, every playthrough of a game like this is going to be different because your encounter deck will give you different cards in different order. Your player deck will give you different cards in a different order. But as a scenario designer, there's a lot more you can do to make a scenario different. And that could be locations that are in play in different places. The locations might be different altogether because you might have to shuffle together 2 or 3 different versions of the same location, and you only get one in your playthrough. So that's one of the more basic ways that the game tries to make the scenarios more replayable. But especially the question we have to ask ourselves, is there more to enjoy on a second or third or fourth, etc. playthrough? Is there some joy to still be had, even if you kind of know what's going to happen on the act or agenda flips? Have anything you want to add to that?
Absolutely. I think that as you were talking about, replayability can come up during setup with different locations or potentially different ways that the scenario progresses. I also think that part of replayability is the resolution of a scenario and how much the resolutions of scenarios can vary between playthroughs depending on how well you did in the scenario and how it can potentially affect or be affected by previous campaign log entries of other scenarios. Effectively, if you have scenarios that can vary wildly depending on previous choices and not just randomness, then that can add a lot to the replayability of a scenario, as well as keep the scenario fresh on subsequent playthroughs.
I think what's really fun is some campaigns really do have multiple paths that you can take, and the individual scenarios may vary more or less in terms of how they might change things, like which tokens might be in the bag, or if you're on, I don't want to, we're trying not to give spoilers in this particular video for any of the campaigns or scenarios, but a lot of campaigns have a couple different factions you might be able to align with, and that will change what actually happens in a given scenario. Sometimes it's almost a totally different scenario.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's replayability. And I also want to note here that we just have a couple comments on these slides, but there's way more that we individually might be thinking about when we end up rating the scenarios. And the sort of scale you can see here at the top is very, it's just a kind of a Likert scale and how much we think that the scenario has answered these questions. And we feel like the more replayable a scenario is, the better it is. But that can take various shapes and forms, and it doesn't have to simply be these examples we've talked about. So when we do talk about a scenario, we will discuss these kinds of criteria among others that we fit into the category more exhaustively. Okay, next one is something I call fairness, and maybe an overall question to ask is, does the challenge in the scenario, does it create interesting and meaningful decisions for the players? And essentially, do you feel like you have some kind of agency, even with the randomness that might be in the scenario? So it almost kind of feels like the opposite of the last question about replayability, but it really isn't, right? Because randomness doesn't have to mean that you have no choice, but rather there may be some elements where you can react to the unexpected elements of the scenario. So can players indeed mitigate some of those random elements?
Yeah. I think that word you said there was huge. It's about agency. This game, Arkham Horror, the card game, is an inherently random game. All the skill challenge tests are random. Counter deck is random. Player decks are random in their order, in their composition. So when it comes to overcoming the randomness of a scenario, how does the scenario allow players to meaningfully act against that randomness? Because while randomness is a key part of this game, there are times when too much randomness can lead to feelings of frustration or annoyance. And generally, that is experiences that the scenario wants to avoid, as opposed to um, feelings of true horror that comes under stress, but are actually controlled and can feel like they can be overcome, rather than feeling like there is absolutely no possible way to react to what is occurring.
Yeah, and it's kind of funny because the game Arkham Horror is trying to sell you on exactly that kind of pressure and experience that if you've played other Arkham Files games or know something about the mythos in general, it seems like the investigator should be kind of at the mercy of the ancient ones, whatever the dark forces involved in the campaign are. But as a game, you don't want to experience that where you don't feel like you're actually playing the game. The game is just you're just experiencing something awful. You want to be able to win the game in some sense, as difficult as it might be. So in this particular category, as well as the next one, I haven't really added the word difficulty, because the difficulty of a scenario isn't necessarily a good or bad thing. It needs to be kind of the right amount of challenge. And to us, I think that challenge can't just be that you're at the mercy of something totally random and you have no possible way to do anything about that. So the second part here is kind of aligns with that as well. Does the scenario apply appropriate pressure on the investigators? And Superfeng, I know we talked about this a little, but I'd like you to kind of add, what does this look like to you in a particular scenario?
Yeah. So pressure for me is about um, reacting to what the scenario is doing in the scenario's framework. So a scenario, right, in general, has a time limit, which is the agenda. And it has obstacles, which are generally the encounter cards that you draw, as well as things that may occur of the agenda or because the agenda flips. And so pressure is kind of the sum total of the forces that are working against the investigators from accomplishing their goal. And when it comes to pressure during a scenario, the amount of appropriate pressure is a fairly nebulous statement, but it is all about the feeling of stress and then ultimate resolution once the scenario ends. And for example, I always find that this game is amazing when we are working towards the final act, and it's also the final agenda, and we just managed to pull through, let's say, at the last doom that could have been placed to the agenda. Right? It's the sort of perfect amount of pressure in that sense, because we were just about to hit that time limit, but we were able to succeed despite the encounter cards and the other effects that were being waylaid against us. So, how much does a scenario contribute to that kind of pressure that makes this game both stressful and fun because of that stress?
Yeah, and it has to still be doable, right? It's not that you flip that last agenda, but you are almost going to, right? So the scenario has
Yes.
to be designed such that it's still possible for you to win, but you're not always going to be, oh, we had 5 turns left, no big deal. So it has to walk that very narrow path. It almost reminds
Yeah.
me a little bit of playing Calvin, where you're kind of doing that with the damage and horror that's on you, which is stressful and has that pressure, but for many players is very rewarding to pull through. All right, let's go on to the kind of next side of this coin, which is balance. And this question is about, is the scenario able to be completed with any reasonable team of investigators? Is the scenario itself designed so anyone could reasonably get through it without the scenario saying, no, you need to use only this one stat in order to get through it all? There has to be more than one strategy available, or archetype, or path for completing the scenario. Otherwise, it feels like the designers maybe had some idea of what you should do, but there's so many different possibilities of decks you can bring to a game, investigators, that's more than half the fun to me, is building your own character. And if you sat down to play and suddenly you realize that your investigator can do nothing, doesn't feel like a very balanced scenario across all of the different possible things you could have been playing.
Yeah. Balance is a very interesting topic because when we were talking about fairness, it's very much a relationship between the scenario and the investigators as a whole. Whereas balance, the way that I think about it is, it's the relationship between a scenario and the individual investigators with each other. Like, does one investigator or one type of investigator, or indeed one type of playstyle, seem overly or not enough advantaged in the scenario? Like you said, either the scenario is relying too much on one stat to contribute towards the progress of the act, or is the scenario um, trying to do something with the investigators that not all investigators require. For example, if an investigator with high evade value will just like completely solve the scenario, well, without having one, the scenario could be very, very much more challenging. I think that that's kind of where this scale lies. It is sort of like a between the card pool and investigators that are available to us. How much do the investigators themselves balance them in terms of the scenario itself?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I want to be clear that it doesn't mean that I'm unhappy whenever there's some kind of a tech card for a scenario. In fact, we are going to talk about that as kind of a fun part. But there's a difference between, you decided to bring a particular card because you knew it would help versus you couldn't really even play the scenario very much because you didn't know or think to know that you had to bring a particular card or investigator. And I think this also goes back to our point about the blind playthrough. How much the scenarios, if you were to go back and play it a second time, would you feel like you know how to solve it? That can be very fun, but an unbalanced scenario will make it feel kind of bad when you play it for the first time because you didn't know anything about the scenario before playing.
Yeah.
All right, last one is going to be the experience. And there's a number of different things that fall under the overall experience. So this may feel like a little bit of a grab bag, but specifically, we want to think about the scenario design. Does it present something that is new and interesting? Now, for the first few of the scenarios and campaigns, almost everything feels very new. But how many campaigns do we have now? 9? 10?
Not 8, 9.
Something like that. There's every new scenario has to bring something to the table that we haven't seen before, or at least has a new spin on something that we have seen before. And some scenarios do this better than others. But the gameplay loop that the designers want you to be engaged with needs to be fun too. So this comes up all the time. Whereas even if you know the scenario for the 10th time you play it, it is a lot of fun to play some of them just because the gameplay loop is so good. But more than that, we can also talk about the theme of the scenario. So the scenarios don't exist in a vacuum. They're part of a campaign, but they're also trying to do something with the overall story of that campaign. They're trying to take you on a high-speed car chase, or you are trapped in the tunnels underground a particular major European cities. So does it actually do a good job of establishing the fiction that is trying to evoke? And sometimes it does a really great job of this, and sometimes you kind of forget about it after a while.
Yeah, I really wanted to not emphasize, but make sure that we included that last point, because I do think that a lot of people's opinions about scenarios, a lot of people conflate this experience with maybe the difficulty of the scenario or the frustration of the scenario. And I do think that when we try to combine those feelings together, there is a bit of nuance that is lost. Like, a scenario can be very frustrating or badly designed, and yet it still is able to evoke the fiction that it is trying to evoke. And I do think that those things are separate. And so that's why I wanted to include that on the experience rating, just to make sure that it is represented as a different scale. It's a different dimension in our opinions.
Yeah, and we'll get to this when we get to the individual scenarios, but sometimes the scenario what it's trying to evoke is really affecting the players themselves, um, as well as the investigators, which is kind of an interesting division that we'll probably keep talking about when we talk about the individual scenarios, that the investigators and the players are not the same entities all the time. And sometimes the designers have done a really fun job of making us as players be part of that story too, or be part of that theme. No spoilers, but if you know what I'm talking about, you know what I'm talking about. All right, so that is our 4 categories, and like I said, what we're going to be doing is giving our own individual ratings on these. So we're not going to necessarily agree on everything. I don't think anyone needs to agree on how they review scenarios in general, but we'll use this as a way to talk about the scenarios and put a little rating on them. This is maybe from 0 to 5 or something in between. I don't really think that matters so much exactly what the numbers or whatever else means, but as we go through each scenario, we'll use this as a point of discussion, especially if we don't agree on any of these particular answers to these questions for a given scenario. All right, anything else you want to add before we close out this video?
I think that you said it all. I'm just super excited to join you in this series.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. All right, so you've watched this video. Hopefully there will also be a nice long list of videos at this point of scenario reviews for you to watch. I will reiterate that if you've not played a particular scenario, we will talk about spoilers throughout. It's kind of hard to review what's going on without mentioning all of the fun stuff that actually does happen. And as always, I recommend, play the game yourself. It is a fun time. And watching other people play is also cool, and you learn a lot. And listening to people talk about scenarios, you might learn a lot, especially if there are paths or avenues that you didn't know about. But play the game first and then come back and listen to us. All right, that is it for now. We will see you in the next video.